what's up? This is Noah Lekas, and welcome to Branding Mag Presents Insights with Outsiders, an interview series dedicated to branding conversations beyond the industry. In this episode, I talked to Finn McKenty, creator of the Punk Rock MBA, a YouTube channel that's reached well over 9 million people globally. Now, Finn has a background in marketing and design, but with over 500,000 subscribers, 80,000 Instagram followers, and a host of other super impressive metrics, Finn has created a brand for himself using DIY ethos and a creator's mindset that's not just a content platform, it's a content community. So let's get into it. Here's my conversation with Finn McKenty. The Punk Rock MBA as a brand, as its own identity outside of Finn. Like, I think one description of it was like information and inspiration, right, for the DIY world. But then I've also
I changed because it turns out nobody cares about that.
Yeah, so let's get into that because that's a really interesting point for me. When you started the Punk Rock MBA, did you have like a traditional brand purpose, identity, and strategy kind of laid out in your head, or was it more kind of let's start making stuff and see what it turns into?
No, I definitely had an idea in my head of what I wanted to do and how I wanted to do it. But, you know, as Mike Tyson says, everyone's got to plan until they get punched in the face. So my original goal for the channel was to help people overcome the problems that I had when I was younger. Basically, you know, the way I grew up, my dad was a corrections officer and my mom never really had a career, and they're both like, you know, great people, but they don't know anything about money or business or careers or anything like that. And so neither did I. And I wanted to do something. I was doing printing at the time, which sucks. I mean, it's basically factory work. And I just really desperately wanted to get out of that work because it was hard and it didn't pay well. And it's not fun. If anyone's done printing, you'll know. But I had no idea really what to do from there. And I was able to figure it out eventually, but it took me probably, 5 years longer than it would if somebody could just sit me down and just explain to me, hey, here's how it works. Here's what you got to do to get out. And I did it, but I wanted to create content that would help other people solve these problems or the other challenges I had. Like, for example, like how many times I wanted to get like a promotion that I think I really deserved, but I couldn't get the bosses to say yes to me. Just all these things related to like careers, and money that I couldn't figure out. I just wanted to help people overcome those things. And so I came up with the name the Punk Rock MBA because I was like, oh, well, I don't actually have an MBA, so that's a lie. But, but I thought that would communicate like, oh, I'm a person who's into business, but I come from this background of like the world of punk and hardcore. That seems like that would be an interesting perspective on business. But there are a lot of things that I got wrong there. Number one, it turns out that nobody cared about my perspective on business because at the time I hadn't really, if I'm being honest, I'd done some things that were kind of cool, I suppose, but it's not like I really had a lot of accomplishments under my belt that like stood on their own as like proof that I'm somebody you should listen to. Not saying that I have now, but I've accomplished a lot more, because of YouTube. Like, people take me seriously now in a way that they didn't before, which is ironic to me because I actually think the other things I've done in my life are more impressive than YouTube. But again, we don't get to decide what people think is meaningful. They decide. Sure. The other thing that I didn't realize, most people that watch my videos don't know what an MBA is. And to be fair, I didn't either when I was like 22 or whatever. And,
sure.
That's kind of a bougie thing to like think about or care about or whatever, And so basically the only part that they understood was like the punk rock part. And so it turns out that what my audience wants me to do is talk about music, like basically alternative music that they liked in high school, and they don't care about business and they don't care what I think about business. And so I would say that I'm cool with where I ended up, I suppose. But I definitely failed at my original, plan of the type of content that I wanted to make and the impact that I wanted to make on the world and the audience that I wanted to build, like I totally failed at that.
It's interesting because for me, when I first found your channel and I first started watching the videos, there was obviously things like Refuse videos and Pantera videos and things that spoke to my background, right? So I sort of went down the rabbit hole. But it became obvious to me pretty quick that there was another part to what you were trying to offer. And then, as I said in one of those other conversations that we had, it wasn't until I heard you express that you had this other piece explicitly that you were hoping could get across that I really put it all together. Because when you work and this is an issue I have too. It's like when you work in multiple areas, like I play music, I work for Branding Mag, I'm a freelance music journalist. Like I do a bunch of, so it's like, how do you pull all the, like,
you don't,
to me, it's the same thing.
Really, just like with any brand, it's very, 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 very difficult to get people to perceive you as more than one thing.
Totally.
Super hard.
Yeah.
Very, very, very few people or brands do it. I think for an individual, the way to do that is once you attain mastery in one thing, then people will be willing to take you seriously in other things. For example, let's take Serena Williams, one of the best tennis players of all time. People will take her opinion seriously on movies or cars or really anything else because of what she's attained in tennis. Like if you put out a video, here's what Serena Williams thinks about the new, Marvel movie, people will care about that. Now, in reality, her opinion on that movie is no more valid than yours. But
sure,
when you have attained mastery at something, it for right or wrong, it makes people care about your opinions on other things.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And it's also, but then there's the other side, which is like an actor becoming a musician or vice versa, right? It's like there's a harder hurdle sometimes to kind of jump those barriers. But it is an interesting thing because for me, there's a through line like for the things in life that I'm involved in. Like I see them all. I'm primarily doing the same thing in all three settings. Like it's not. I don't see them as different at all.
Right.
And so when it comes to, I guess what I'm curious too is like, I heard you say something about how you don't really make the brand. You sort of put raw materials out and then you sort of make that brand with your audience. But one of our recent contributors, Brett Rakestraw, he did this piece called The Dynamics of Brand Ownership. And it was kind of about how companies with their consumers sort of make the brand culture. And he cited Fred Perry, right? Which, because Fred Perry in recent years pulled a shirt after the Proud Boys started wearing it.
Oh, right.
And there was a Save Fred Perry campaign on Instagram campaign to like save Fred Perry from becoming a symbol of hate. But I thought it was an interesting way that you framed it is like you put out raw stuff because it's not really raw what you're putting out. Like you're not putting out, like it's a very polished, well thought out, like you're putting out
Lego pieces.
You're putting out products and ideas. So yeah. And then they're sort of deciding which ones they'll accept or not. But like, I just would love to just kind of discuss that. Like, how do you think that works for what you're doing? What ownership do you put on the audience? What's up to you to kind of narrate that conversation yourself with them? Like, how do you find that balance?
I don't really know exactly how to answer that question. I'll say for myself, and this is not true of every person or every brand or anything like that. I'm just for myself. What I have found is that I do not have a lot of control over that brand. The more I have, like, I have not been very successful at changing what people think my brand is or how they see me or whatever. And the more I try, the worse it is. Like you wrestle the pig covered in mud and you just get mud all over yourself, and the pig is mad and you're frustrated and you're just like, why did I even do that? Now that might be because I'm like, well, for sure, some of that is because I'm not doing it, like, of my execution. Like there's for sure mistakes I made, or there's something there that I'm not seeing that I could be doing that would help to shift that perception. And for whatever reason, I don't see it or I can't execute on it. On the other hand, it's also true that, like, you know, the audience, consumers, whatever, you know, their beliefs and emotions are what they are, and you can't change that. For example, Procter and Gamble has a really good framework that they used to use. I don't know if they still do. Back when I was working with them, called part of like the way they develop a brand is they find out the ACB, the existing or accepted consumer belief. Which may or may not make any sense. For example, people believe that your hair needs to be nourished, which logically makes no sense because hair is not living tissue, so it can't be nourished. But that's what people believe. And so if you look at the way they talk about Pantene, for example, which I don't know if they still own that, but they used to, when they talk about Pantene, they talk about it in a way that reinforces that accepted consumer belief that your hair needs to be nourished. People actually feel the same way about furniture. They found out from doing research. People think that, like, furniture needs to be nourished, and so they use that same kind of language with Pledge furniture polish. These things don't make any sense, but again, we don't get to decide what the audience believes. You can just choose to work with it however you want to work with it. And if you want to challenge that, go for it. But I think you'll find that challenging people's existing beliefs is a rough road.
Yeah, no, it is a rough road. And brands spend, you know, millions trying to figure out how to shift those beliefs.
Yeah,
you know?
like
So,
I just watched a video about the Arch Deluxe. Do you remember that? The McDonald's did, like, in the 90s?
Oh, yeah.
I vaguely remembered it, but they spent like $300 million on developing and marketing this burger because they found themselves in this situation where basically that people thought McDonald's was like cheap food for kids. And so they created this thing called the Arch Deluxe that was marketed towards adults. And to make a long story short, it didn't work. They burned $300 million and just scrapped the whole thing. Now, they definitely could have executed better, but I think there's also, you know, there's a point at which you just sort of have to make the call that the existing beliefs are what they are, and you know, we can't shift to those. We just got to work with them where they are. And I would say I probably fall more on the side of accepting those beliefs rather than trying to challenge them. And I don't know if that's always right. I probably give up sooner than I should at times. On the other hand, I also see a lot of people waste a lot of time and energy trying to challenge things that they aren't successful at changing. So I think it's a really difficult thing to find where that line is.
Yeah, it's always a tough call. Like, do you stand in the river screaming at the current,
Yeah.
you know, or
Exactly.
do you just roll with it?
Hop
you
on
know?
the inner
It's
tube and float down.
Yeah, it's a tough call because there is a time to stand and definitely a time to stand and fight the current.
Definitely.
And then there's a time to pick your battles, I suppose. Like with the McDonald's
Yep.
thing, I don't know if I remember that burger specifically, but I do remember them doing like a more premium line or trying that, and then that not sticking around super
They tried
long.
to do salads. That failed because it turns out people just want their Big Mac.
Yeah. Yeah. McDonald's salad. Yeah, that's I guess I've never thought about going to McDonald's for a salad either.
Yeah, exactly. And they tried so hard for years because they recognized, like, oh, people see our brand as being a place where you go eat this really unhealthy food. Consumer habits are changing to embrace, this is maybe mid 2000s or something, when, you know, organic and stuff like that was getting more popular. So
Sure.
let's lean into this trend, which I think was a valid call to make. But it turns out that in hindsight, that's just not what people wanted from McDonald's.
So something like consumer testing, right? Like or consumer reviews or whatever. Like there's two very staunch camps, right? One is like customers don't know what they want. They don't know what they need. All they know is what they had last time and liked. So
Yep.
don't ask them. Then the other one is like, no, find out exactly what they want, make that exact thing and hand it to them because that's how you make the most money. Like
Yep.
It sounds like, from what you're describing, you're a little bit of the latter, but your ideals would be to try to be a little bit more of the former.
Well, it's both, and this is what Procter and Gamble is incredibly good at: is ask people what they want, but learn how to go several layers deeper and understand what they're really saying. Because what people say they want is oftentimes different than what they actually want as revealed by their actions. And the people who are the best at this are able to parse out what you really want, what you're telling me. You said X, but we have developed a process, or we're just innately good at understanding that what you meant when you said that is Y. So, for example, like what I have realized, again, is that what my audience wants from me is, like, ultimately it's to give people a dopamine hit. And that is by validating their taste in music. Is to say, hey, that music that you like, it's really good. That's what they want from me. And what they'll say they want is like, oh, make a video about this band I like, or that band I like, or whatever. And at the end of the day, that's just a dopamine hit. That's what they want. Now, for me, I enjoy having sort of thoughtful conversations that might look at the good and bad of any particular piece of music or trend or something like that. But what I've noticed is that anytime I say something critical about something that my audience likes, it's very, very badly received. No matter how hard I try to like soft pedal it and take it easy on it, it's like, say anything negative and that is not going to go over well. So I've realized, okay, just praise the things they like. That's what works. You know, and an example of the opposite of that would be, I don't know if it's still around, but there was that branding blog called Brand New. Is that still around?
I'm not 100% sure.
So what they would post anytime someone did like a branding update, like the new Pepsi logo or whatever, they would, you know, post it, and then someone would write like sort of a review of it. And 100% of the time, maybe not 100, but like pretty close to it, it's always like the old one was better.
Sure.
You know, and so do you want, you know, you got to choose your battles. Do you want to fight your audience by telling them that actually this new Pepsi logo is really good and here's why? And then read 1,000 comments of them telling you how stupid you are and like how you're wrong about everything and you're trash and you don't know anything about branding? Or do you just be like, all right, I'm just going to tell you the new Pepsi logo sucks, and then you'll say that I'm great and give me money and we move on?
I think that the anti-nostalgia thing of like embracing new technologies, new platforms, this is something in the branding world, like creative directors, people will just rail against. Like I've sat in meetings with people saying like Instagram is stupid, it's never going to last. Like, who cares? Who cares about influence? Like, so I mean, so there's that part of it.
New thing bad, old thing good.
Yeah, and I think that you've done a good job, even if you're saying like in some realms the content, you're not leaning into like your purist perspective as to like some of the older stuff not being as good. The way you're presenting your content and you're moving through it, like you've done in a very interesting, embracive way of new platforms. So I think that's one thing that's really interesting to me. But also, like, I heard you say something about rock music, and I actually think like this applies to you as well. And I think it was really interesting where you talked about embracing the wins, right? Like rock music refuses, like it's like Led Zeppelin 2 is great and everything else sucks. Like it refuses to embrace like the wins at all, you know? And
new things have happened that you should be taking credit for.
Yeah. And so I'm curious, like, how have those philosophies, like, do you feel like those have played into your success a bit as a brand? Like, is that part of how you approach things, or is that sort of an external lens that I'm putting on it?
I think there's probably multiple segments of my audience, but I would say let's say that there's two segments for the sake of this conversation. There's the people like yourself that maybe are looking for more than just the dopamine hit, and that are willing and able to process nuance. And I think those people appreciate the stuff you're talking about. And those people are not just looking for validation of their priors. And I very much appreciate those people. And that's awesome. And I always love hearing from them because those are always great conversations when I do. That's a pretty small segment of my audience, I think. So for people like you, I think that's probably why you like my videos. For the majority of the audience, they either don't notice that stuff or actively dislike it. So if I leaned into that, I would have a much smaller channel. And if I leaned into, new thing bad, old thing good, I would have a much bigger channel. There's an agency, which I won't name, but they're very famous and have written all kinds of books and think pieces and TED Talks and blah, blah, blah about how smart they are. And everyone thinks they're, fucking Einstein. And I ended up doing quite a few projects with them through P&G, and their actual internal documents and work was like average to trash.
Sure.
And I realized that what they were actually extremely good at was branding their agency.
Sure.
But the quality of their work itself was kind of shitty. Like really basic stuff. Like we worked on this idea for like a pill dispenser. The idea was like that you would just push a button so there's like those pill cases with like the day of the week.
Oh yeah.
So the idea was, well, what if instead of having to put those out every day, it would just be this device that's on your nightstand or whatever. You just push a button and it dispenses your pills for the day, and we would load it up with a monthly supply of all these vitamins, and that's the thing. So they came up with this really nice looking concept for this thing that was like maybe about this big, something like that. It's like the size of my fist. And our mechanical engineer looks at it and he's like, how many, does the 30-day supply? And how many pills, blah, blah, blah. He just does a little math and he's like, okay, so that thing needs to be this big to fit 30 days of pills if you're saying people take this many pills per day. And I'm holding up something that's maybe the size of like a milk jug. Just like that level of like basic competence was beyond them.
Sure.
Of like just doing the math of what volume does this thing need to be to hold all these pills. And I realized these people are charlatans that are just great at branding their agency and having dinner with the right people, at the client and schmoozing them and getting them to sign some insanely the client spent like $800,000 on this thing and got nothing useful, and then came to us and we're like, sorry, we only have $100,000 left. Can you help us salvage this? And we did it. And I'm proud of the work we did. But at the end of the day, they're laughing all the way to the bank.
Sure.
And that was very disillusioning to me to realize that I don't know that authenticity wins. I think perceived authenticity wins, which is oftentimes very different. The reason that I am saying tell people what they want to hear is not because I'm cynical, although there's probably a little bit of that because I'm so frustrated by having this experience for so much of my life. The reason why is because I want to help people who may have similar experiences to me or maybe to you or whatever, of like, basically that when you are your authentic self, the world does not reward that, which I think is probably a common experience for a lot of people. For better or for worse, like the way I feel is like it's their world and I just live in it. And I don't get to choose like how other people perceive things or how they want me to be or whatever. All I've noticed is that I have been more happy and more successful when I just go with the flow and play the game and do what people want me to do. I'm not saying that's the right thing for everybody. I'm just saying that for me, my life got better when I started doing things that way. So if the things that I'm saying resonate with you, maybe try it. You can push against the river all you want, but it may not make you happy. So that's my point. It's not because I want to be cynical and tell people to be dishonest or anything like that. I think for some people whose brains may work the way that mine works, you can't always say what you think.
Yeah, I think it's a point well taken, and I think it's Wu Wei, right? It's the action through inaction. Like sometimes you just have to,
Yes.
you just have to let things be. But one thing, so I kind of just had kind of two questions that I kind of wanted to wrap up on. One was, at the end of 2022, you shared a video where you were very authentic, I thought, but sharing that you had felt,
I was. That's all
sharing
real.
that you felt that your content hadn't stayed up to a quality level that you were proud of in some regards, like certain pieces. There were some pieces you were proud of, like I think real notably, like for me, the one you did on Pantera, I thought was fantastic. I thought the one on Ice-T was great. I thought, I mean, so there's obviously, it's not like you were saying that.
I think the Pantera one is terrible.
Do you really?
But thank you.
Oh, I mean, that's a side conversation.
No, not terrible.
It's
Mediocre.
a side conversation
Yeah.
that I don't agree that that's the order that the albums go in. But the beyond that, I enjoyed it a lot.
And the reason why I'm saying that I don't think that video was great, because that would fall into the I did not want to make that video, but my views were down, and I was like, all right, I need to make something that people are going to like. So I did a Wikipedia video about Pantera, and people loved it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can see that part.
And I'm sure anybody who works in the branding world has the same kind of experiences of, like, you show the client 5 ideas, 3 of them you love, 1 of them you think is trash, 1 of them you think is kind of okay, and they pick the one that's okay and they love it and it's super successful, and you're like, really?
Yeah.
I had much better ideas than that, but
It's
all right.
it's the pitch that you put in just to be killed. It's like, all right, well, they'll kill this one, and then we'll get them focused on these 2, and then they pick that. Yeah, of course, yeah.
It's the same way with YouTube.
How do you, as a brand like the Punk Rock MBA, how do you plan to sort of try to balance that of keeping those views, you sort of have a threshold now that I'm assuming with sponsors and people that you need to maintain, but
Yeah.
you also have an increasingly strong inner voice that seems like pushing you to try to break out and do more and do different things. So kind of, is there a plan moving forward for that?
Yeah. So my audience, as I've discussed, has, fairly narrow boundaries of what they want me to do, which again is the same for any brand, or most brands anyway. When you try to step outside the lanes of what people expect from your brand or you as an individual, how many times have you gone to your boss and said, hey, I can do this thing. Like, is there a way that we can have that be part of my job? And they look at you like you have lobsters coming out of your ears, because it's like, what? Well, you do this thing. How could you possibly also do that thing? And you're like, all right, I guess I just do the one thing. So, I mean, this is a universal kind of challenge. And so for me, I would really, really strongly recommend that people read 2 books on this subject. One is called Profit from the Core, which is a guy who I believe he headed up the strategy practice at Bain Consulting. His name is Chris Zook, Zook. And that's about the importance of focusing on the core in your business or your brand. His second book is the sort of follow-up / counterpoint to that, called Beyond the Core, which is about how to grow beyond your core without alienating that original core, because that's the challenge, right? Like, how do you expand this thing without losing the base that you've built? It's really hard. And the framework that he outlines in that book essentially is like, you can think of it as, it's not exactly this simple, but think of it this way: it's like, it's 1 point for every kind of every layer of newness you're adding. So like new product, new audience, new market, new technical capability, new team, like any layer of newness you add to this thing adds 1 point. And once you get past 2 points, it's very likely to fail. And again, read his book. He gets into a lot more nuance to it. But that's the point, is that you want to try 1 to 2 points of newness, not 8 points of newness all at once. Because if you're doing a new product for a new audience in a new market with a new technical capability and a new team, how often does that work out? Hardly ever. So for me, what I'm trying to do is very gradually expand into more mainstream topics, more mainstream artist music and topics. Like in a perfect world, I would like to be able to make a video about Justin Bieber or Ariana Grande. But that's like many steps of newness for my audience.
Totally.
And so I'm quite confident that if I was to do that today, people would hate it and it would fail. So what I'm trying to do is gradually step out a little bit more. So for example, I made a video about how TikTok is changing the music industry.
Yeah.
And let's say that I had 10 different examples in there. I don't know how many it was, but let's say it's 10 examples. 7 of them were about artists that I know my audience likes or cares about. But 3 of them were about like mainstream pop artists. And I put like in the thumbnail, if there's 3 artists in the thumbnail, 2 of them are sort of in that safety zone of stuff that I know my audience will be receptive to. And the third one is something new. So those experiments don't always work out, but I have found that as long as I sort of play it safe like that and just only add 1 or 2 layers of newness to the topic or the artist that I talk about or whatever, so far that's worked. For example, I did a video about No Doubt recently that was one of my most popular ones I've done in a long time. Mm-hmm. And that would be an example. Like Gwen Stefani is like a mainstream pop star, but they have roots in the alternative world. And so to me, that was a good example. That was that's like a perfect example of what I want to do more of, is like people that are kind of mainstream pop culture figures, but with roots in the alternative world is sort of my plan for how to do that, if that makes sense. Any video that I make, I want it to be the best video that's ever been made on that topic. In particular, I care deeply about getting the facts right, and I'm never going to be perfect about that, but my litmus test for it is like, if the artist watches it, which they almost always do, are they going to watch and be like, oh, nice work. Like, yeah, he got that one right. That's the test for me, more so than the fans, because like, fans don't know what really did or didn't happen. I want the artist or their team to watch it and respect it, which I think by and large they do.
Yeah, and I think this is one area where like the brand narrative part, like I would personally encourage brand strategists and branding people to watch some of your videos, because I think it really outlines like shifting a narrative of how something actually happened, how a brand, like forget it's a band for a second. And this has been like a soapbox I have been on for years, but just like forget it's a band. It's just a brand. Like at some point I had to.
That's how I look at it.
Like, I had to decide at some point, did I like Black Flag or did I like Black Flag's logo? And like and that's a choice we all have to make, like
I could write videos because I used to do this work all the time in the branding world. I could write a video about Pizza Hut or, fucking whatever, like Panera. That like, I take the same approach that I would to writing about Pizza Hut. I just happen to write about bands, but it's the same thing.
Totally. Yeah. And that's how I see it.
Like consumer, like brand, the shift in narrative is actually, I'm glad you mentioned that. Like the shift in brand narrative, I've never actually thought about it in those words, but that's like a huge part of my videos. In fact, if anything, it might be the main component to my videos. I don't really talk about the actual music all that often. It's more about the shift in brand narrative. For example, the band Creed, which people will probably remember as being, like the cheesy Christian hard rock band from the mid 2000s. And everyone laughed at them and said they sucked. But it turns out and that their singer was like a douchebag and stuff. But I learned more about him, and it turns out he had like this horrible abusive childhood. Yeah. And that's the reason why he was kind of a douchebag back then. And so the core of that video is like, hey, here's this band that everyone thought was just a laughingstock, and this guy was an asshole because he was drunk on TV and stuff. But actually, if you get to know him a little bit, I think you might change the way that you see the band. And there are thousands of comments like that of like, wow, I didn't realize he went through all that. That really makes me see him differently.
Yeah, 100%. And that really, the crux of this series of what my goal is to accomplish with this whole branding beyond the industry series is to get people to see the branding insights and the excellence in certain aspects of branding that people are just casually accomplishing in areas that they're not looking. Like I don't think if you sat down in a brand strategy meeting with a major corporation and I pulled up that Creed video and went like, this is what we need to do, guys. I don't think that would be like a 1-to-1 for people. But
Right.
My hope in the conversation is that like you as being someone who I think excels in writing brand narratives and rewriting brand narratives, that starts to come through. And I think that to me that was really one of the things I was most excited to cover with you. And in that spirit, one last question for you is, if you had like one thing, one philosophy, one branding insight, one punk rock MBA, line that you wanted people to hear that you don't think maybe somebody would get about what you do, or an insight that they could learn from you that the major industry as a whole doesn't know or maybe needs to hear, what would that be?
There is one very simple question that all of us should ask ourselves at all times with everything we are doing, whether that is about managing our own careers or manage or doing client work, or if you are on the client side when you're thinking about, the strategy work that you're doing or branding, like any of these things, the question you always have to ask yourself, and it be brutally honest about it, is who gives a shit? Like, you made this 75-page PDF. Who gives a shit? Right? And there might be and I'm not saying that work is useless, but what I'm saying is, if it stays a 75-page PDF that somebody paid a bunch of money for, and only the 5 people who worked on that project ever sort of really understand deeply, and the rest of the people just skim it, and that's all it is, that's a failure, because nobody will ever give a shit about that work. And if you come up with this elaborate strategic framework, but you never express it in a way that reflects things that people in the world actually care about, that's a failure too, because you didn't ask who gives a shit. And if you go to your boss with some idea about some project you want to do, but at the end of the day, it's really about your own creative satisfaction, not something that's going to help your company or the client or whatever, like, nobody's going to give a shit. So you always have to ask that question. And if you don't have a good answer to that question, then don't pass go.
Yeah, I mean, that's sage advice once again. And we've come full circle. The difference between journaling and writing is editing and considering your audience, right?
Absolutely.